buddy Brecker. How you doing?
Okay. Thanks for having me on. Like your show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That really means a lot because the only way I've been able to get people to join me is really just from word of mouth and people giving me a chance. So the fact that you've done that really means a ton. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Where are you coming to us from right now?
I'm coming from, I'm in Long Island where I live, East Hampton, in my basement where we record a lot and do a lot of music things. In fact, we've been down here all day recording a couple tunes for a wonderful trombonist arranger named Javier Nemo.
Mm-hmm.
So we just got done and got set up for this.
What's your studio setup?
Well, it's just Pro Tools, a simple Pro Tools setup, and it seems to work well. It's a low ceiling, so the horns sound good in here, for recordings. And we've been getting a pretty decent amount of work. Probably have done close to 400 sessions for people, or 400 tunes. I save them, and I was actually surprised that it was that many. But it beats going to halfway around the world.
That's for sure.
For tidbits. So we enjoy. My wife's a fine saxophonist. Her name is Ada Rovati, and she's also gotten really good at just as an editor and a recording engineer for Pro Tools. So we have a good thing going between the two of us.
Are you going all digital, or do you have analog equipment as well?
No, it's all digital.
I got to be honest. My roommate's a big audio engineer. He's all into audio, all that. I appreciate analog stuff. I will say, to be honest, it is so much nicer just to go straight in the box. And for a lot of things, the only people who are ever going to notice the difference between digital and analog are going to be the people making it. No one listening is going to hear the difference.
Yeah, I don't think you can tell the difference on your phone, since that seems to be the main listening device these days. And I have my old LPs in the next room and nice speakers if I ever, occasionally I get nostalgic and I put stuff on. But I like flitting around from one thing to another, as we all do. I'll listen to part of one record and then go, or part of a tune, and then, let me listen to this. I might listen to, like, in 5 minutes, maybe 15 different things, and I'm in a certain mood just for poking around. So it beats putting on a record and the old scratches, and it's just too time consuming. It's a lot quicker.
How long have you been in East Hampton?
Well, I've been had this house for over 30 some years, and I was in basically a summer place, and we rented it, and I was in Manhattan most of the time. But the way work came and the rents kept going up, and I lost my rent stabilization thing, or whatever they called it. So we moved out here full time about 10 years ago.
But you're originally from what, like 30 minutes outside of Philadelphia, right?
Right.
What was it?
Cheltenham Township.
How was it growing up? What'd your parents do?
Well, my father was his main thing was being a lawyer, but he was a piano player and a songwriter and singer. That's what he really loved. Grandparents came from Austria, Hungary, Russia, in that area, and he was nervous about doing music full time. Very smart guy, but he was a great musician. So we had a lot of music at the house, piano playing. And we had a family band when my brother started playing saxophone, and my sister is still with us and plays harp. But back then she was a fine classical pianist, and she doubled on bass. We both doubled on drums, and there were jam sessions at the house all the time. My father's friends came over. So there was a lot of music in the place.
If your father was cautious for his own career about becoming a professional musician, was there any kind of hesitancy from him when you decided you want to be a professional trumpet player?
Yeah, he gave us not grief because a big part of him had wished he had done it professionally. He did work around Philly, and a lot of his friends, the guys he came up with, particular songwriters like Moose Charlap, who wrote Peter Pan, and Bobby Troop, who wrote Route 66, and I'm forgetting a couple other guys, but there was a clique of songwriters, and many went to the same summer camp where I eventually went, and where my father met my mother, who was a visual artist, very good she was. And a lot of the guys became professional songwriters, and it was a great camp. My brother's counselor was James Caan, as a matter of fact, the actor.
Really?
It was a sports camp, but they had a very heavy music program and put on full-fledged shows. It was known for that. It was called On a Bar in Geneva. Yeah, James Caan, we called him Superman. He had a great athletic body as a young 20-year-old, or however he probably was then, and it was a fascinating place. Marvin Hamlish, the great singer-songwriter, was the head of the music program at the girls' camp. So they really put on some great shows. And Dad had written a lot of camp songs that 30 years later they still were being sung. So I always tell this story. When I was 2 weeks old, he wrote a tune for me, and he just forecast what I was going to do. So, in answer to your question, they, I think, were hoping that maybe we would do something else, a more stable lifestyle. But as soon as we got kind of a little more well known, he was very proud that we did what he did, and he'd go over to like Oscar Peterson and introduce himself, and we'd saying he was the father of the Brecker brothers, et cetera, et cetera. We tried to say, "Don't do it, Dad," but he got really into it. And this song he wrote, the first line was something like, "I'll be so proud of you, Sonny, when I hear you give out on that horn." So I was 2 weeks old. My future was kind of foretold by this tune. He said I'd play drums, maybe a hot fife, and love music even more than my wife. So, so it was so much music around. We almost didn't have any choice.
So
we like to play.
How old were you when you really started taking music seriously?
Well, I started taking trumpet, and my brother started taking, who was 3 years younger, started on clarinet. I started on trumpet. That was my kind of go-to instrument, partially because Dad had so many trumpet player records, and the great Clifford Brown was alive in Philadelphia playing all the time. And Dad loved Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie, Chet Baker. He had a lot of trumpet records. And Mike, as he put it, got stuck with the clarinet, but that was a good thing for him. We both studied with musicians from the Philadelphia Orchestra, and particularly Mike, I think, really realized the fact that his 5 years on clarinet really gave him a good foundation to switch to alto saxophone when he was in ninth grade, and then tenor saxophone, and the rest just was history. He had great chops, and they say that studying clarinet is really a good thing if you want to be a woodwind player.
So, were you only playing jazz when you were first learning, or you listening to other stuff as well and learning that?
Well, we were studying like classical etudes, and my teacher Sigmund Herring was a well-known teacher, and still actually his books are still utilized by young students all these years later. And but mostly we were listening to records and playing jazz or trying to improvise. I had the idea when I was not much older, probably 9 or 10, to take some of my dad's records. We were speaking about that earlier, up to my room and start playing along with records long before the Abersold thing and play along records came out. And that's basically how we really learned how to play, was by listening and just playing along to Miles Davis doing. I started with ballads. I was when I was young. I didn't have a lot of technique, so I used common sense. And I think one of the first records is 1955, so it's probably about 10 years old. Was Miles's first record on Columbia, and they opened with "Round Midnight," the ballad. So I learned that, and I developed pretty good ears, unconsciously from being able to play along with the records so well. I had pretty good self-taught ear training, even though I didn't know I was doing that,
When you
and a way to articulate too.
When you were young, did you have any other hobbies or passions that you were actively pursuing, or once you found music, was that really all you were doing?
Yeah, that was really it. Mike had a couple other things he liked to do. He got serious later than I did. He was a good basketball player and he loved his chemistry set, so he was into science. And but he studied music like a science when he got serious about it in ninth or 10th grade. But somehow I just really enjoyed the sound of the trumpet, and I loved music. And uh, I took part in a lot of the jam sessions at home when I got a little older. There was a great trumpet player named Bobby Mojica, who sadly just passed away a couple years ago. He had a great career. He moved to Detroit, but he was really a great player. So I heard great jazz playing from a trumpet from my earliest recollections. And we stayed in touch. He introduced himself to me all these years later. I think I was playing with Horace Silver or someone. He came up and said, "Hey, I'm Bobby Mojica." And of course, I remembered him from when I was a kid. And he was active till he passed away too, as a trumpet player.
Mm-hmm. So when did you first start making money really as a musician? How long was it where you were just playing in jam sessions, and when did you start really making
Well,
money and making a career?
that's a good question. I was about 16, I guess 15 or 16. I came up, there was a lot happening in Philly back then musically on a lot of different levels. And I was in a thing that was led by the then drummer, Jimmy DePriest, who became known as James DePriest, a very famous classical conductor. Sadly, he contracted polio, so he couldn't walk. And he became a very famous classical conductor, but he was a jazz drummer. And he had a thing called the Philadelphia Youth Band that I guess I auditioned for and I got in. And my good friend, we still play together. In fact, we're playing together next week. Lou Tabakin, the great saxophonist, who's about 5 years older than me, was also in the band. And slowly but surely, I started to get, especially when I got a car, or I borrowed my dad's car. I think he eventually I had a car when I was 16. I think we lived out in the suburbs, and I would drive to school, and it allowed me to drive to gigs. So I guess when I was about 16 or 17, I started doing gigs around Philly.
Were you working any other jobs while you were doing that?
No, no, and I just kept working, man. I kind of, for the most part, didn't have to borrow money from my parents. I had was making enough and got my name kind of around, and they were mostly dance kind of gigs, not jazz gigs. Uh, uh, but there was a lot happening in Philadelphia
So then,
back then.
what ended up sending you over to Indiana University?
Well, when I was 15, I went to band camp there, the Stan Kenton band camp. The whole Stan Kenton band was there. The Cannibal Adderley Sextet was there with Yusef Lateef and Louis Hayes, Joe Zawinul. Donald Byrd was there and took me under his wing. And I met a lot of young musicians there: Dave Sanborn, Don Grolnick, Peter Erskine, who was only 7, but he could play at 7 drums. And it was a great environment there. They had a great music school, and a new building was opening. They had some amazing grants. So when I decided, I was trying to get a liberal arts education, but I ended up wanting to go back to Indiana because it had such a good reputation as a music school, and was only one of it was jazz wasn't allowed in a lot of the colleges yet, and they didn't really have a full-fledged jazz program, but they always had a first-rate playing jazz ensembles. So I went to music school there.
Now, how long after you graduated did you stay in Indiana?
Well, actually, I didn't quite graduate. Our band was very good, though, and we won a jazz festival, the Notre Dame Jazz Festival, which was the premier. It's what all the college jazz bands worked towards. That was the biggest festival competition. In 1965, we won the competition. Clark Terry was a judge, and he gave me a trumpet award. In fact, I don't kind of remember. I don't remember any of the other judges at this point, but all well-known people. And we were awarded a State Department tour to the Middle East and Asia if we wanted to do it, which we did. Jerry Coker was the band director at the time. And in February of 1966, I only had a little more than one semester left. We left for the State Department tour for 4 months, more than 4 months, 16 weeks. Fascinating trip. Imagine we're 18, 19 years old, seeing the world like this. First time I had flown anywhere, and we were, by the end of that 16 weeks, we were hardened musicians and hardened road warriors. And that led to another competition, which eventually led me just moving to New York. In 1966 in Vienna, it's the only time they had an international jazz competition. We read about it in Downbeat when we were overseas. So some of us made our way to Vienna to the competition and tried out, and several of us made it to the finals. The judges were great. It was Mel Lewis, Ron Carter, Joe Zawinul, Cannonball Adderley, J.J. Johnson, and Art Farmer. Mm-hmm. Doesn't get much better than that for judges. And there were also, once again, a lot of young players there, my age, none of us known yet. People like Miroslav Vitus, George Mraz, Tomasz Stanko. These are all people that came very well known later. Jiggs Wiggum, Eddie Daniels, Franco Ambrosetti, Joachim Kuhn, Claudio Roditi. I'm leaving out some names. I think I might have mentioned Joachim Kuhn. So that was really a fortunate situation, because after that, several of us decided to move to New York. I decided to go to NYU, where I studied with another fine trumpet teacher. But Miroslav and Mraz and eventually a couple other guys moved to New York, and we helped each other, So it was being in the right place at the right time. And when I moved to New York, I played in a lot of soul bands, first, and rehearsal bands, but eventually Clark Terry called, who had heard me at the Notre Dame Jazz Festival, asked me to join his big band, and Mel Lewis, who was one of the judges at the Vienna thing, asked me to join Thad and Mel band. Mm-hmm. So work started really coming in, and I was also part of the Duke Pearson big band, a lot of big bands, eventually the original Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So, like I said, I was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I was going to say, interesting. How'd you get hooked up with Blood, Sweat, and Tears so quickly after? And then were you touring with them as well as playing? Because I know you played on their first record. Were you just on the record, or were you also touring with them as well?
No, I also toured with them for about a year. And it's a funny story that I've told many times. But during that time, towards the end of the year, they were getting ready to do their second record. But Horace Silver had called, and I had auditioned for him. I was doing a lot of jazz gigs in New York by then. My name got around from playing in all the big bands. And I had met, it's a whole other side thing, Woody Shaw, who was Horace's trumpet player at the time. I had met him in Seattle. I spent one summer out there when I was 19. That was also a great musical summer. Seattle was amazing. There was a lot of a jazz club. That's where I met Woody, where they had Horace Silver one week, Art Blakey's Jazz Messenger. So I met Lee Morgan, and Woody recommended me to Horace, and I auditioned and eventually got the gig. And I decided to leave Blood, Sweat, and Tears because I just wasn't playing enough. It was a fun gig. I learned a lot about the business and how to do those kind of records, and socially it was great, traveling around in a rock band. And we went out to California and played all those famous places, Fillmore, et cetera, heard, Cream, opposite Cream, and Stevie Winwood. I learned a lot, and I always loved that kind of music anyway, growing up in Philly, which was really a potpourri of different styles of music. But this was a nice opportunity. So I decided to leave Blood, Sweat, and Tears and join Horace Silver, where I could really play all night instead of just playing horn parts.
So were you making good money? Were you making good money with Blood, Sweat, and Tears?
No, it's funny. I was making $100 a week, maybe $200. And but it was a salary. Mm-hmm. Horace was offering $250, so I thought it was a little raise, and he said we'd work three weeks a month. and travel around, and was a great band with the young Billy Cobham on drums, fresh out of the Army, and John B. Williams on bass, who was a student of Ron Carter's, who eventually was the band leader on the Arsenio Hall show, and the great Benny Maupin on tenor saxophone, who played with everyone later and was on Herbie's great bands and did all those great things with the Headhunters. So it was a great band, a great opportunity. And they begged me to stay, and they were going to cut the horn section in as equal partners because we were really salaried guys. The rhythm section had really started Blood, Sweat, and Tears, particularly Al Cooper. And Bobby Colomby, the drummer in the band, had found the record company thought Al wasn't a strong enough lead singer, so they had found another singer. We had a band meeting. And they had found a guy in Canada named David Clayton Thomas, who was also a songwriter, and they wanted to add him to the band. And Al didn't go for that, and he quit. And I took it upon myself at this meeting to announce that I was also leaving the band because I wanted to play with Horace Silver. And we left on good terms. They wanted me to stay, of course, but they were all jazz fans, and they understood I wanted to play. And I coerced my friend, the late, great Lou Soloff, who was sitting next to me the next day at a Joe Henderson big band rehearsal. I said, listen, Lou, I'm in a spot because Horace has some gigs and I'm still in Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I need a quick replacement. They're going in the studio. Pays, I think it was $100 a week, whether you work or not. So by the end of the rehearsal, I talked him into it. And make a long story short, they went in the studio, recorded several tunes, 3 of which became #1 hits. And their second record, as you probably know, what became Record of the Year. They had Spinning Wheel, You Made Me So Very Happy, and there was a third hit. I think When I Die was another hit. They had sold 11 millions, won the Record of the Year at the Grammys, and their salaries went up to the thousands a week. They were making a fortune. I was still making $250 a week with Horace.
Now, were you perfectly satisfied, though, because you were getting to play more? Is that like, money's good, but I'm more happy where I am now?
Yeah, I was happier musically, but I often thought, they're making a lot of money. And, in fact, I was taking lessons with Lou. We would drive out to New Jersey, take a bus out to New Jersey to study. We had done that for months before all this stuff happened, even. Take a bus and study with a guy named Edward Troidel. And then Lou started picking me up in a limo to go out to our trumpet lessons, cackling the whole way. And they all bought houses but in the long run, it was a good move because Horace's gig led to many other things. And a couple of years later, the real Blood, Sweat, and Tears broke up. They had never really quite duplicated the success of that second record, even though they're still, with young guys in the band, they still tour around. Bobby Colomby owns the name, so there's still a Blood, Sweat, and Tears on the road with guys that are and are happy to do it. Mm-hmm. Was all great music.
How was that touring experience different with Blood, Sweat, and Tears when you went to Horace Silver? Are you, like, when you were on tour with Blood, Sweat, and Tears, were you the kind of person that's like, after a show, I'm going out, I'm going to party? Are you going in and resting for the next show? And how was that different or the same when you ended up joining Horace?
Well, it was a little different in the fact that there was more of a social scene. In the rock world, you hear all the stories, and a lot of them are true. I was 20 years old, or 21, 22, a young man. So, yeah, we were all on the hang after the gig. I can't imagine even doing that now. But there were certain similarities. The jazz musicians like to hang too, but it was more less. I can't think of the word. Less crazy. Mm-hmm. Let's put it just like that. But it was, and I really wanted to play. The Horace thing was just fantastic to play. We played all over the world. It's my first official trip as a player to Europe. We played at Ronnie Scott's and traveled all around. And I stayed with Horace. I would have stayed longer for a couple of years, but eventually he wanted to move to California, and he gave us 2 weeks notice. Typical Horace, and he broke up the band. By then we were really tight too.
Mm-hmm.
So we came back to New York, but that had led to other things.
Yeah, that's when you went to
Eventually,
the Jazz Messengers, right?
for a while, yeah, Woody once again came through, and Art Blakey needed. I came back with no gigs, so I stayed with Art for 8 or 9 months. It wasn't a great period in his life. Mostly we played in New York and the East Coast, but that was also a thrill to play that material. Sadly, the tenor player in the band just passed away recently. Carlos Garnett was a Panamanian saxophonist, and we did a lot of his tunes. I hadn't started writing yet, but it was a thrill to play with Art back then. And then eventually I left. All right, well, he kind of just disappeared. That's another crazy story. He sometimes had trouble paying the band, and it was a period where he just owed me some money, and we had played in Washington D.C., and then he just kind of disappeared. And a band had started. My brother moved to New York and had met a trombonist named Barry Rogers, who's a wonderful late Barry Rogers. He died very young, sadly. He was the only one who was a completely clean liver, too, ironically. His son's a great trumpet player, Chris Rogers. And he in turn had met a couple singer-songwriters who who were starting a band called Dreams. And Mike said quite innocently, well, we need a trumpet player and a drummer. And I said, well, I'm not doing anything right now. And Billy Cobham's available because he came back from Horace, back in New York. So that band started. We started rehearsing and great tunes. We jammed up all the horn parts and made it a little different than Blood, Sweat, and Tears. It was really a jazz rock band in that respect where there weren't really written arrangements. The tunes lent themselves to kind of jamming every night. We had arrangements that we jammed up and we'd add to them, we'd change them. It was an interesting band, and we eventually got signed to Columbia Records and did 2 records for Clive Davis. And with a certain amount of, I guess we were kind of a cult figure band. Musicians liked it and never really sold that much, but that's what established us as studio players in New York, because a lot of contractors would go to our gigs, guys that hired people for record dates, and we got well known, particularly on the East Coast. So that was really what started our recording careers.
Did you track those 2 records at Van Gelder's in Jersey?
No, the first one was tracked for some reason, and I forget the reason, at a studio in Chicago rather than New York. There was some reason why we went out there, which I don't remember. Maybe the Columbia had their own recording studios, and maybe they were busy, so they probably had a studio on the cheap in Chicago. The second record was done in Memphis at Steve Cropper's studio. That was a direction by Clive Davis, who thought that would be a good idea for us to get some of that Southern funk into our system. And we went down there for 2 months, and we were then all writing, and we'd replaced a couple guys in the band with Will Lee on bass, who was only 17 at the time, and Don Grolnick, who I had met at the band camp, and a great guitarist named Bob Mann, who I still talk to, and we were working a lot. So we got well known enough to get our names around, and then we started all doing a lot of studio work.
So then when did you start writing material for your solo record? And then what ended up having you leave Dreams and start pursuing your own solo career?
Well, the reason Dreams, we just eventually broke up. I'll tell you what happened, that McLaughlin had come to town, John McLaughlin, wonderful guitarist. In fact, he was staying at my apartment for another interesting story. I had was going on the road with Horace a lot. Dave Holland had come from London to join Miles Davis, and he didn't have a place to stay. I went up to hear the band on one of his first nights, and we got to talking. I was going on the road on a month tour with Horace. So I told Dave he could stay at my apartment on 73rd Street. And when I got back a month later. He was there. He had been touring, but he was there. And there was another guy in the apartment. At first, I was a little taken aback because I just told Dave he could stay there. And the apartment was kind of messed up there. You could tell they had been there for a while. And I was going to say something, but the guy, he was laying on my bed. It was a guitar, leaned up against the wall. Oops, sorry. And he started playing guitar, and I went, whoa, who the hell is this guy? I'd never heard of guitar. Turns out it was John McLaughlin. And he came to New York also to start playing with Miles or just start a career in New York. And eventually he formed the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and Billy Cobham was the guy to, everybody wanted in their band. And so Billy left Dreams to join Maha, and we were left without a drummer. We tried, something like 60 drummers. It became legendary auditions, but nobody played like that yet. So eventually we just kind of threw in the towel. We were working a lot in the studios anyway. Our records hadn't sold enough for them to keep us at the label, so that was a problem, and the band just kind of dissipated. And I spent the next few years not only in the studios, but time was the Mahavishnu Orchestra didn't last that long, but they became really popular, really famous, particularly Billy in the band. So he started his group. He had a hit record called Spectrum, his first LP, where he wrote all the music, and he asked Mike and I to join his band, which we did. And that's when I really started to write my own music. I started thinking, it's about time that I really kind of buckle down and find where I'm at musically. And Dave Sanborn, who I'd met at the Stand Kids, funny how all these things are so interconnected. And I'd stayed in touch with Dave, who had been playing with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. He had moved to New York from Woodstock. We had stayed in touch all those years. In fact, we had done some gigs together when I was with BS&T opposite Butterfield. And I had the idea that would be a good horn section, me, Mike, and Sanborn. So I just buckled down, and during the period with Billy, I was home writing my own music.
So how long was that to write the whole album out?
Well, that took a good year and a half, I think, something like that. It was slow going. Was self-taught as a composer. I was self-taught basically as a pianist, but I could get around on keyboards and the piano, and I bought a clavinet, and I would just play and record everything on cassettes. I didn't have a 4-track yet, and came up with things like that became known as some skunk funk and squids and Sponge on what became the first Brecker Brothers record. And that's another interesting story. A lot of these I've told before, but I was just getting ready. We had it was an outgrowth of Dreams, a rehearsal band, a jazz rock rehearsal band. By then, Will Lee and Grolnick and Chris Parker, a great drummer, who played on the first record and was in the original Brecker Brothers band, lived in it wasn't really a loft, but they lived in the same apartment building. So we'd go over there, Mike and I, and rehearse. Grolnick was writing music. Steve Kahn, whom we had met on guitar, was writing. And we just get once or twice a week. It was great because I could hear the stuff I was writing. I had been intending to do a solo record, really, because I was writing all the music. And got the music pretty tight, and I got a call from a guy named Steve Brecker, who had just signed a production deal with Clive Davis, who we knew already from Dreams. He had signed us to Columbia. But in the interim, there was some kind of scandal. He got fired from Columbia and was accused of this and that, and he beat the rap. He wasn't doing anything that anyone else didn't do as far as payola or whatever. and had started a new record company called Arista. And he was interested in the music that I had been writing, according to Steve Brecker. The only caveat was he wanted to sign the band, and so we wouldn't have to. What you had to do was do a demo usually, and then find somebody to take around and try to sell your music to the record companies. So if I took this deal, I wouldn't have to do any of that. The only caveat was Clive Davis wanted to call not the band, but he wanted to sign us as the Brecker Brothers.
Do you think that was for
And
notoriety? Like he thought it would sell better?
he thought, yeah, he was a genius at this stuff. The alliteration. Mike obviously was a great, amazing saxophonist, and he thought it would sell the band better if rather than Randy Brecker Band or Randy Brecker Group, whatever I would have thought of. Plus, and I protested, as much as I could, but it was too good of an opportunity to turn down. So I eventually said, okay, call it the Brecker Brothers. Mm-hmm. And we went in and recorded all that stuff. And then Clive wasn't finished with me. It's funny, the other Mike really wasn't career oriented yet. He played great and he was doing a lot of sessions. Everybody thought he was wonderful, as was Sanborn, but Sanborn wasn't really career oriented either. They both just were practicing their saxophone and doing gigs around town and doing some sessions. But Clive had, so I was basically the band leader, even though it was the Brecker Brothers. I had a long meeting with Clive, who said, man, I love everything you recorded, but, and whenever you hear but from Clive, there was going to be something, earth-shattering, was the next sentence. You guys need a single. And basically said, unless we did a single, because I said, look, first of all, you're calling it the Brecker Brothers. It's supposed to be all my music. We don't have any more tunes. We recorded everything. He said, well, if you're not going to put you need a single or we can't put it out. It just, there's nothing on there we can really sell. It's great music, but we need a single. Mm-hmm. So I trudged back to the rehearsal room. And we actually, because we were good at that, remember I said we used to jam stuff up in dreams. We just jammed up a tune, and it became, had the title was Sneaking Up Behind You. Mm-hmm. Everybody contributed, I still have the cassette. It took about 4 hours. Everybody had little ideas, and we were best friends, so there was no negativity in the room. We were really good at just accepting other ideas. So the 7 or 8 of us figured out this tune. We went to record it a couple days later. Clive was at the session and loved it, thankfully. And that tune became a hit, got up to number 2 on the R&B or whatever they called them back then, the R&B charts or the urban charts. As a result, the record sold. He was right. The record, I figured, the record, most, even jazz rock records, you would sell maybe 5,000 copies, if we hadn't had the single on there. I was kind of doing it as a hobby because we were so busy in the studios. Next thing we know, this thing is a hit, and the record got up in the top 40s of the top 200 albums and was selling like 100,000, 150,000. We were in shock. So I learned never to argue with Clive, just let him do whatever he wants. And that's how the band really got started and got popular, was all his genius.
And now, obviously, when you're writing this music in the studio, you're just thinking about what is the best thing that I can write to make the song good. But you guys particularly have music that I would say a lot of your music is iconically difficult to play. So after you write this, you go, oh man, this sounds good. We got a great take. Do you ever think do you ever kick yourself thinking like, son of a bitch, did I have to write this horn line freaking difficult?
Yeah, or it was hard to play over. You constantly run into that as a composer. You may, at least I did, and I think a lot of composers do that because when you're composing, you can write anything, but then you have to play it. And I in a way felt bad that the music was so hard, but particularly Skunk Funk. because it was difficult, became kind of a rite of passage for young fusioneer musicians. And there's thousands and thousands of versions of it on YouTube from all over the world. It's fascinating. In fact, my friend Louis Juritz compiled a video where every bar is a different band playing skunk funk from beginning to end. I've never counted how many bands, but every bar is a different band from all over the world, or dancers, or ice skaters, or flute players, or violinists. So it's gratifying to see that so many people took to that tune in particular.
I have a funny skunk funk story actually. When I was in high school, my band that I was in at the time played. I'm from upstate New York, from Central New York,
Yeah.
and we played the Syracuse Jazz Festival, and you were playing I think the day after, and we had already known, we kind of had skunk funk in our rotation. We had this whole debate. We're like, should we play it? Like, is it cool if we play it? Because it's like, hey, we love your music. Or are we assholes? Because it's like, now you're going to go play. Like, when someone plays someone's music at the same festival.
Yeah.
So we finally ended up deciding we're going to play the tune. So then we do it. And while we're playing, I remember turning around and you must have heard, and you were standing in the back of the stage. And then from that point on, I think is some of the worst playing that the five of us individually, because we folded under the pressure completely. And I can't go back and watch that. You see us go like this, and then it's just absolute just dog shit for like the next 3 minutes.
Too bad. But I'm sure it was better than you think. But you're easily distracted when that stuff happens. Same thing has happened to me a million times. You find out somebody's in the audience, and then you can't get that out of your head, and you can't just think of the music to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's but thanks for playing the tune. I appreciate it.
I'm happy you enjoyed it. Afterward we were all like, oh, we did it so good in rehearsal that we got nervous and flubbed it. But I feel like when you're 17, that is the perfect time to do that. Because
Sure.
Might as well just rip the Band-Aid off, and then you have that better experience. Kind of have that. It makes you more hardened to that kind of thing in the future when it really matters more.
Yeah, sure.
Now, Randy, I would be remiss if I didn't ask. I only got a couple minutes left, but
okay.
I'd say an iconic thing about you is the flat cap. If every musician, I think when they picture Randy Brecker, they picture you with like the beret style flat cap. I wanted to ask, when did that come into play? Like when was that? When did that really become your thing? Why did that become your style?
Oh, well, that's it. I was always a kind of a hat guy, even before I started losing my hair. I just always thought it gave some kind of character, and it was a way for people to recognize you. So really, that was it. And I thought I looked good in hats, I guess. Even when I was in high school, I always wore hats around.
Well, this morning, sorry, keep going.
No. And then I got into the Kangol hats, and usually this is unusual, not just a baseball cap, keeps the lights out of my eyes too. It's another reason to wear them on stage, because I can kind of, if the lights are too bright, you can kind of adjust your hat so it doesn't kind of hit your eyes. So that's another common sense reason. But it was probably, and also Chuck Mangione always had a hat on. I just thought it was a way to distinguish yourself from other players, and make you more easily recognizable.
Mm-hmm. Well, this morning I was thinking, well, if you're coming on the show, I need to take style inspiration. So I ran to Hoyt Schermerhorn in Brooklyn, and I picked up the closest thing that I could find to get my full Randy Brecker on. But I think I got a size too small. But I think I'm going to adopt this. I think this is going to become part of my life now.
Yeah, man. I like it.
I appreciate it. Well, Randy, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I appreciate it more than you even know. So just thank you so much for that.
Okay, well, thanks for your support, man, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who watched. We're going to be live next Friday at 8 o'clock, so I'll see you all then. Have a good night.